equations, and we're going to be looking at the quadratic ones and how to complete the square. What is it? A method to solve quadratic equations. Why? Will always work. Interesting fact. To conserve energy overnight, a hummingbird enters a hibernation-like sleep state called torpor. Now, here are the examples we're going to be discussing in today's video. So let's take a closer look at example 1. Let's read the steps. Step 1. Is the number in front of the x squared 1? Step 2. Divide the number in front of x by 2. Step 3. Square that new number. Step 4. Add to both sides. Step 5. Solve. Let's read the question. Solve the equation x squared plus 8x minus 9 is equal to 0. We're going to go ahead and rewrite the equation to show our work. And now we're going to go ahead and add 9 to the left side, so we can only have x's on the left side. And negative 9 plus 9 are inverses, so they cancel. And now we're going to add 9 to the right hand side. And now let's write down what we have so far. We have x squared plus 8x is equal to 9. Let's talk about why we've added two blanks, one on either side of the equal sign. The blanks help us complete the square, so we can use the inverse of square, which is square root. And now we're going to move on to the next step. So we're going to divide 8 by 2, and then we're going to square it. So right now we have 8 divided by 2 squared, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. So we have 4 squared, and 4 squared is 16. So now we're going to go ahead and add 16 to both sides to help us to factor the left side, so we can use the inverse of square, which is square root. Now let's go ahead and begin that process and write down what we have so far. So we have x squared plus 8x plus 16 is equal to 25, because 9 plus 16 is 25. We're going to rewrite 16 and 25 because they're both squared numbers as 4 squared and 5 squared. Now we have x squared plus 8x plus 4 squared is equal to 5 squared. Let's go ahead and factor the left hand side, and we get x plus 4 in parentheses squared is equal to 5 squared. Now, where do we get that plus sign? It is the same sign in front of our middle term, or 8x. Since we have a plus sign there, we also have a plus sign in our next step. Where did we get the 4? The 4 comes from the 4, and the 4 squared from the previous step. And now we need to solve for x, so we're going to go ahead and do the inverse of squared, and that is square root. And when we do that, those two operations cancel, and we're just left with x plus 4. Since we took the square root on the left hand side, we now need to do it on the right hand side, and those two operations will cancel once again, the square and the square root. Now let's write down what we have so far. We have x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus 5. Wait a minute. Where did that plus or minus come from? Well, we introduced a square root, so we're going to have two answers, and that is why we need the plus or minus. Also, if we take a look at the original equation that they gave us, x squared plus 8x minus 9 is equal to 0. The highest exponent in the equation is squared. That number tells us how many answers or solutions that we are going to have. Now let's write down the two possible ways to find the two answers, the one for positive 5 and the one for negative 5. Let's solve for positive 5 first. So we have x plus 4 is equal to 5, and now we're going to subtract 4 on the left hand side to cancel out the numbers because they are inverses, and since we did it to the left side, we're going to do it to the right side, and 5 minus 4 gives us 1. So that is one answer, x is equal to 1. Now let's go on to the next equation that we have. We have x plus 4 is equal to negative 5. Let's go ahead and subtract the inverse of plus 4, and that is minus 4, and those two numbers cancel. We now need to subtract 4 on the right hand side, and now we have x is equal to negative 9, because negative 5 minus 4 is negative 9. We have our two answers for example 1, and now let's move on to example 2. Let's read the question. Solve the equation 2x squared minus 6x minus 5 is equal to 0. Let's rewrite the equation so we have more space to show our work. And since we're solving for x, we need to move that minus 5 to the other side. And the inverse of that is plus 5. And because of that, those two numbers cancel. We now need to add positive 5 to the other side. And now let's write down what we have so far. We have 2x squared minus 6x is equal to 5. Now let's take a look at step 1. It says, is the number in front of x squared 1? Well, we have 2 right now. And to make things a little bit easier, we're going to go ahead and divide every number by 2. So we can get our a term to be 1. And 2 divided by 2 is 1. And negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And 5 divided by 2 is 5 over 2. We have a fraction. Don't too worry. It is the same process. Now we have x squared minus 3x is equal to 5 halves. We have also done the next step by adding the 2 blanks. And now we're going to figure out what goes there. So we're going to divide that minus 3 by 2. And we're going to square it. And negative 3 halves squared gives us 9 over 4, or 9 fourths. Let's go ahead and add 9 fourths to both sides to help us factor the left-hand side so we can use the inverse of square, which is square root. Now let's go ahead and change that 5 over 2 to 10 over 4 so that we can add the 2 fractions on the right-hand side, since now they have a common denominator of 4. And we did that by multiplying the top and bottom by 2. 5 times 2 is 10, and 2 times 2 is 4. So now we can go ahead and simplify the right hand side, and we get 19 over 4. So now we have x squared minus 3x plus 3 over 2 squared is equal to 19 over 4. We can't write 19 over 4 to something to the power of 2 because 19 is prime. So we're a little bit unlucky in that way. So now let's go ahead and factor the left-hand side, and we're going to write it as x minus 3 halves in parentheses squared is equal to 19 over 4. Where did we get that minus sign? Well, we take a look at the previous step, and at the middle term we have minus 3x. We bring down that symbol inside our parentheses. And where did we get that 3 halves? Well, we take a look at the previous step once again. We look inside the parentheses of the squared term, and it says 3 halves. So we bring that down in our parentheses as well. And since we're solving for x, we need to get rid of that square. And in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and take the square root on the left-hand side. Because square and square root are inverses, they cancel. And we're just left with x minus 3 halves on the left-hand side. Since we took the square root on the left-hand side, we need to take the square root on the right-hand side. Now we're going to go ahead and move this step to the right side of the screen so we have more space for the next steps. Now this may seem like a lot of steps, but a lot of the time you can go ahead and combine some of these steps so you can save paper, your ink, your graphite, or your lead. And now we're going to continue by rewriting that square root of 19 divided by 4 as the square root of 19 over the square root of 4. And now we're going to rewrite square root of 4 as 2 squared because 2 squared is 4. And now we can go ahead and cancel those inverses of the square root and the square. And now we're going to write down what we have so far. So we have x minus 3 halves is equal to plus or minus the square root of 19 divided by 2. Wait a minute, we have plus or minus. Why do we have that? Well, we introduced a square root. And when we do that, we introduce a second answer. So that is why we have plus or minus. And also, if we take a look at the original equation where we have 2x squared minus 6x minus 5 is equal to 0, the highest exponent is 2, or squared, and that tells us how many answers or solutions we will get, and that matches why we have plus or minus. And now we need to get x by itself, so we're going to take the inverse of minus 3 halves, and that is plus 3 halves. And now those two numbers cancel. Now we need to add 3 halves on the right hand side as well. And so we get x is equal to 3 halves plus or minus the square root of 19 divided by 2. Now we have one more step just in case, because a lot of the times you're going to see it written like this. So just to show you why and how. So we have x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 19 all divided by 2. And that is our final answer, and that is example 2. Now let's take a look at example 3. Let's read the question. Solve the equation negative x squared plus 4x plus 12 is equal to 0. Let's rewrite the equation down so we have more space to show our work. And since we're solving for x, let's go ahead and move that positive 12 to the other side. In order to do that, we need to do the inverse of that, and that is minus 12. And those two numbers cancel, and now we need to minus 12 on the other side. And let's write down what we have so far. We have negative x squared plus 4x is equal to negative 12. If we take a look at step 1, it says, is the number in front of x squared 1? No, it is not. We have a negative sign. In order to get rid of that negative sign, we're going to divide each number by negative 1. And the result of that is x squared minus 4x is equal to 12, because negative 1 divided by negative 1 is 1, and 4 divided by negative 1 is negative 4, and negative 12 divided by negative 1 is 12. We've added the blanks on both sides of the equation sign to help us complete the square, so we can use the inverse of square, which is square root. In order to do that, we need to add the same number on both sides so we can factor the left side. So once again, we can take the square root of the square. In order to do that, we need to find the middle term, which is negative 4x, and divide negative 4 by 2, and then square it. So let's show you how to do that. So we have negative 4 divided by 2 squared. Let's simplify inside the parentheses, and negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So now we have the parentheses of negative 2 squared, and the result of that is 4. So now we're going to go ahead and add 4 to both sides so that we can factor the left-hand side. Now let's go ahead and simplify the right-hand side and add the 12 and the 4 to give us 16. So now we have x squared minus 4x plus 4 is equal to 16. We're going to go ahead and rewrite some of these numbers as something squared to help us once again factor. We're going to change 4 to 2 squared, and we're going to change 16 to 4 squared. And now we have x squared minus 4x plus 2 squared is equal to 4 squared. Now we're going to factor the left-hand side, and we get x minus 2 in parentheses squared is equal to 4 squared. We need to get rid of that square, and once again, the inverse of square is square root. So we're going to take the square root on the left-hand side. So those two operations cancel, and we're just left with x minus 2. Since we took the square root on the left-hand side, we now need to do it on the right-hand side, and those two operations cancel, and we're just left with 4. So let's write down what we have so far. X minus 2 is equal to plus or minus 4. Wait a minute. Where does that plus or minus come from? Well, we introduce a square root, and when that happens, you introduce a second number. So that is why we have plus or minus. And now, once again, let's take a look at the original equation. Negative x squared plus 4x plus 12 is equal to 0. If we take a look at the highest exponent, 2, or squared, that tells us how many answers or solutions that we will have. And that corresponds with plus or minus, so that is why we have 2 answers. Let's go ahead and write down those 2 equations, one with the 4 and one with the negative 4. So we have x minus 2 is equal to 4. Let's go ahead and add the inverse of minus 2, and that is positive 2. So those two numbers cancel. Now we're going to add 2 to the right-hand side, and we get x is equal to 6. And now let's take a look at x minus 2 is equal to negative 4. The inverse of negative 2 is positive 2, and those two numbers cancel. So now we're going to add positive 2 on the right-hand side, and negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. We have our 2 answers, 6 and negative 2. That is example 3. Let's move on to example 4. Now let's read the question. Solve the equation 5x squared minus 125 is equal to 0. Wait a minute. We don't have a middle term. In this case, we are lucky, so we can actually go ahead and solve it a different way. Let's rewrite the equation down. And now that since we're solving for x, we still need to move the minus 125 to the other side. We're going to add the inverse, which is positive 125, and those two numbers cancel. And now we're going to add 125 to the other side. Let's write down what we have so far. we have 5 times x squared is equal to 125. The inverse of times is divide, so we're going to divide the left-hand side by 5. Those two numbers cancel, and we now need to divide by 5 on the other side, or the right-hand side, and the result of that is 25. Now we have x squared is equal to 25. We're going to rewrite that 25 as something to the power of 2, and that would be 5 squared. So now we have x squared is equal to 5 squared. Now we need to solve for x. We have x squared. We need to get rid of that square, and the inverse of square is square root. So we're going to take the square root on the left-hand side, and we can now cancel those operations, and we're just left with x. And since we took a square root on the left-hand side, let's do it on the right-hand side. And now the square and square root cancel, and we're just left with the number inside, which is 5. But once again, when we square root, we introduce another number, and that is why we have plus or minus. So in this case, our answer is x is equal to plus or minus 5, and that is example 4. Now it is your turn, so go ahead and pause the video so you can take your time to answer this question, and I will show you the result in 3, 2, and 1. If you got it right, congratulations. If not, there is always tomorrow.